but we're going to be looking at 1.5 verses. And even then, we're not going to exhaust all that's in those 1.5 verses. But here's just something I want to draw out for us here as we begin this study. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son. The author writes to these discouraged Christians. He writes to those who are potentially just feeling so worn out. And he doesn't begin by addressing them and saying, come on lads, cop on, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, try harder. He begins just by saying, Jesus is great. Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God. And he just points them towards Jesus. And the first paragraph, the first chapter, has nothing to do with humanity at all. You can read the first chapter, there's not a single mention of a person, much less them, much less, them in their faltering, troubled states. He just says, I just want to talk to you guys about how great, how precious, how wonderful Jesus is. And then after establishing how wonderful Jesus is, in further chapters he says, come on, let's follow him, let's be encouraged. And so we're going to consider just how good Jesus is. And I believe that is a great start for us to not lose heart and to not be discouraged, to not lose heart, to not give up. The main point of this whole paragraph, this whole book, is Jesus. It says in that first 4 verses that he is the heir of everything, the maker of everything, the maintainer of everything, that he reflects God in every way. He purifies his people from their sins, and now he sits enthroned above the world that he makes and upholds. And that's a great and wonderful thing to consider. So we see in that paragraph that we see that Jesus works as revealing God to us, and then also he saves people. We're going to consider his saving work next week. But here we have time only to consider his work of revealing God. He divides, you'll note in verse 1 and 2, divides the whole history of the world. He divides the whole history of eternity into 2 halves. And you see there's the division there. He says that in former times, God spoke through prophets. And now he has spoken through his Son. Just 2 divisions. And there's not a third time. He says there's not going to come a time when Jesus is superseded by something better, because the point is that there's nothing better. He's not going to say that something perfect will come, because the point of this book is that you can't get better than perfect. And so Jesus is that ultimate, final, conclusive revelation of who God is. But let's consider the old ways. Verse 1. It says that in the previous era, God was at work making himself known to his people. We see even in the very first verses of the Bible, Genesis 1, it talks about how God is a speaking God, that he speaks and communicates, and that he makes humanity and then begins communicating to humanity, telling what they're made for, how they relate to him. And then, of course, humanity sins, Adam, Eve sin, and then chapter 2, was it 3? I think the end of chapter 2, it says that they sin, and then they hide themselves from God. And then so God speaks to them. He communicates. He speaks to them to seek them out. And he's been continuing to speak and to communicate to sinful people who are avoiding him, who are fleeing from him, who have sinned and want nothing to do with him. God, ever since Genesis chapter 3, is speaking and communicating to people. It says that he revealed himself not occasionally, not every once in a while, but it says he revealed himself at many times. And not uniformly, but it says in many ways. And so when we think of God revealing himself through the prophets, Of course, we think of perhaps the Old Testament prophets, like Elijah and Daniel and Ezekiel. And it's a very good thing for us to think of those prophets. But we should not only think of them. What prophets mean here just means the whole Old Testament writers. That the ones who penned down the Old Testament for us are considered that's how God has spoken to his people through the Word. And they reveal who God is. They reveal what God is like. They declare what God is like. And so when we think of the prophet Micah, the book of Micah, and it just emphasizes how much God cares about justice. When we think of Exodus, and we think of the exciting story of redemption, when we read of the heartbreaking story of faithfulness and betrayal in the book of Hosea, when we think of the repeating of the law in Deuteronomy, when we think of the love and devotion and passion that we see in the Song of Solomon, when we think of the redemptive care of Ruth, when we think of the holiness of Leviticus, when we think of the poetry of the Psalms, when we think of the power and glory of Daniel, all of these and more speak to us of who God is. They point us towards the character of God. And his revelation is so big and so vast that it doesn't all fit in one biblical book. That there's not one prophet, one speaker, one author that can fit who he is. And so, in many ways and at many times, God spoke to us through the prophets. We need them all to see the full Old Testament picture. We see him in the Old Testament commands, the Old Testament exhortation. We see him in the stories, in the dreams, in the mighty acts of redemption, in the still small voice, in the burning bush. We see these are some of the ways that we see the diverse and multifaceted nature of God. And you know, I love the Old Testament. I love it. I look forward to Wednesday nights. It's Old Testament night. Yes! And, some of you perhaps would know the man Pete LaJoy. He was visiting here about 2 weeks ago, and I spent a bit of time with him. And he introduced me to a group of his friends and says, this is Mike. He is like the Old Testament guy. So I love the Old Testament. And just thinking of the diverse ways that God has spoken, and even just thinking again by means of illustration, just of a painter that's trying to just portray something, and so the painter would just use as many different brushes as she's able, using as many different kinds of strokes, as many different colors and textures to get across the portrait or the subject that's trying to be painted. And I just think that the Old Testament is a wonderful, wonderful portrayal of who God is. But you know what? It's insufficient. It's so great, but it's not great enough. All the prophetic writings, all the mighty acts of redemption, all the care and love that we see in the Old Testament, it's not enough to truly and fully and completely reveal God to us. Does that blow your mind? Have you even read the Old Testament? It's big. And that's not enough. It's great, and it's not great enough. Hebrews 1:1 says, long ago, God revealed himself through the prophets, but now in a better way, he has revealed himself through Jesus Christ. There's the expansive, but yet incomplete work of revelation in the 40 books of the Old Testament. But Jesus has now come. And all those writers, all those prophets and priests and kings, they came at different locations and different times. But now Jesus has come, and he came once. And he is the complete revelation of who God is. It's wonderful to think about that. And we will see that the author of Hebrews reminds us of the words of Jesus as revelatory of God. But we should not only think of Jesus' words. Some of us might have a red letter Bible where the words of Jesus are in red. But you know, it's not just Jesus' words that reveal God. It is his whole life. His entire life, his entire ministry is one of revealing God. Allow me to read a quote from David Guzik. He says, "The revelation from Jesus himself was unique. Not because because it's phrased awkwardly. It's not David Guzik's fault. The revelation from Jesus himself was unique because not only was it purely God's message, as that was the case with every other inspired writer, but it also was God's personality through the message came. The personality of Paul, Peter, John, and the other biblical writers is clear in their writings. Yet in the revelation that is from Jesus, we see the personality of God. We think of Jesus as being the personality of God. Does that blow your mind? Colossians 1:15. It says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. That he is the image of the invisible God. The word there for image it's actually icon. When we think of the word icon, perhaps even in this congregation, we think of perhaps one of two things. Maybe some of us who come from perhaps a more religious background or tradition, we would think of an icon as a painting or as a statue that people devote themselves to in order to understand who God is. Or perhaps some of us, or maybe more tech savvy, or we think of an icon as an image on your desktop or your phone that gives access to a program or to a file behind it. And you know, when we think of Jesus as the icon of the invisible God, he is that with which we access God. To put it in the words of Timothy, there's one mediator between God and man, the man, Jesus Christ. We go to Jesus to know the unknowable. We see him to see the invisible. And as Jesus said to Thomas, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. So in many ways and in many times, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us fully and decisively and finally and perfectly by his Son. And that should color our understanding of Jesus. When we see Jesus inviting children to himself, that he might bless them fervently. He is the icon. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the personality of God. And in the complex and hard to define Trinity, that as Christ has come, he is representing all that the Father is, as one that wants to call us to himself, to fervently bless. As we see his indignation against cruelty, his indignation against hypocrisy, he is the image of the invisible God. As we see his love and care for us, he is the image of the invisible God. He is the ultimate, final, perfect revelation of who God is. And this author wanted to encourage these people with that truth. And my prayer, my goal is that we might only just be encouraged by just the identity of Jesus and who he is and what he points us towards. We're going to conclude by a brief summary of Hebrews 1. When I say brief, I mean like about a minute. We're just going to see what Jesus is. Because after 1.5 verses, we've seen a bit of who Jesus is. And it's encouraging, isn't it? Allow me just to summarize what's in store for the next couple weeks. In Hebrews chapter 1, if you have it open, I'm going to point out verses and you can just kind of follow along a bit. In Hebrews 1, verse 1, we see that Jesus is better than the prophets. In verses 4 to 7, we see that he's better than the angels. In verse 2, it says that he's the Son of God. In verse 2, it also says that he is the heir of all things. It also says in that same verse that he's the sustainer of the universe. It says that he is the creator of the world. Verse 3 says that he is the radiance of God's glory. Verse 3 also says that he's the exact representation of God's nature. It also says that he's the high priest of perfection. It also says in that same verse that he is the exact representation of God's nature. I read that already. That he's seated at the right hand of the majesty on high. Verse 4 says that he is possessor of a more excellent name. Verse 6 tells us that he is the one whom the angels worship. Verse 8 says that he is the exalted king. Verse 9 says that he is the Lord of righteousness. It also says that he is the anointed one. 11 says that he's the eternal one. 12 says he's the unchanging one. And 13 says that he is the ultimate conqueror. And that's our Jesus. Be encouraged. Let's